Android used to be the last honest operating system left on a phone. You could unlock the bootloader. You could sideload whatever you wanted. You could flash a custom ROM at 2 in the morning because you were bored and nobody stopped you. That is the Android I grew up with. And if you are watching this, it is probably the Android you grew up with too. But that Android is being quietly phased out right now in 2026 while most people are not paying attention. And by the time they notice, the door will already be closed. So I did something that probably sounds extreme to most people watching this. I took a phone, wiped Android off of it completely, and put Linux on it instead. Not an Android fork, not a de-Googled version of Android with the tracking stripped out. Actual Linux. The same kernel family that runs servers, laptops, and your smart TV, except this time it was booting on a device with a SIM card slot and a phone dialer. And today, I want to walk you through exactly why I did it, exactly what Google has been changing that pushed me toward this, and exactly what it is actually like to use a phone that has nothing to do with the Google or Apple ecosystem at all. Let's start with the part that actually matters, because I don't want this to just be a nostalgia video about how things used to be better. Something concrete has changed on Android, and it changed this year. Google has spent the last several years slowly tightening the App Store style verification model that used to only apply to apps distributed through the Play Store, and starting in 2026, that same verification requirement is being extended to apps installed from anywhere, including apps you sideload directly as an APK file from outside the Play Store entirely. Google is building this into Android as a dedicated system component, and the rollout has already begun in stages. Developer verification became available for early signups in late 2025, went live for all developers earlier this year, and starting in late September of this year, certified Android devices in Brazil, Indonesia, Singapore, and Thailand began enforcing it for real, with a global rollout plan to follow in 2027. To be fair to Google, and I want to be fair here because I think it matters, they are not removing sideloading entirely. Verified apps still install exactly the way they always have with no extra friction. Developers can also register for a free limited distribution account to share apps with a small group without a full identity verification process. And ADB, the developer tool used to install apps directly from a computer, is being preserved specifically as a workaround for technical users. But if an app comes from a developer who has not gone through Google's identity verification process, which requires a legal name, address, and government-issued documentation, installing it now requires an additional advanced sideloading flow with a mandatory waiting period before the install is allowed to complete. I want you to sit with what that actually means for a second, because on the surface it sounds like a reasonable security measure, and in a lot of ways it genuinely is. Google's own numbers, which they have published themselves, show that malware arrives through sideloaded APKs at a rate dozens of times higher than it arrives through the Play Store, and unverified fake banking apps and counterfeit messaging clients are a real problem that hurts real people. I am not here to tell you Google invented this restriction out of nowhere for evil reasons, but I am here to tell you what the practical effect is for anyone who actually depends on an open mobile operating system, whether that is a developer testing their own app before publishing it, a privacy-conscious user who deliberately avoids Google's ecosystem, or a hobbyist building something small for a handful of friends. The open door that Android used to represent is being replaced with a door that only opens automatically for people who have already registered their identity with Google. And once that becomes the default architecture of the world's most used mobile operating system, the platform stops being something you fully control and starts being something you're granted conditional access to. This did not come out of nowhere either. Bootloader unlocking, the process that lets you replace the entire operating system on your phone rather than just sideload individual apps, has been getting harder for years, not because of any single announcement, but through a slow accumulation of carrier restrictions, manufacturer policy changes, and warranty terms written specifically to discourage it. A small number of manufacturers, Google's own Pixel line among them, still support official bootloader unlocking. But a large share of phones sold through carriers around the world ship with bootloaders that are locked by default and, depending on the carrier and region, either difficult or effectively impossible to unlock through any officially supported method. Combine that trend with the new developer verification requirements layered on top of Android itself, and you get a picture of a platform that is closing gradually, door by door, in a way that is easy to miss if you are not the kind of person who was ever trying to walk through those doors in the first place. So here's the actual decision I made. Rather than keep fighting an operating system that is increasingly built to restrict what I can install and run on my own hardware, I decided to remove that operating system entirely and replace it with something that has never been built around that philosophy at all. Linux, in its desktop and server form, has spent 3 decades being developed around the opposite principle. You own the device. You decide what runs on it. Nobody outside your own machine gets a vote. And over the last several years, a small but genuinely dedicated community of developers has been working to bring that same philosophy to phones specifically, building full Linux distributions that boot, make calls, send texts, browse the web, and run apps on real phone hardware, completely independent of both Android and iOS. Let me walk you through what that actually looks like in practice, because I think a lot of people hear Linux phone and picture something abstract or purely theoretical, and it genuinely is not. The most well-known hardware built specifically for this is the PinePhone and its successor, the PinePhone Pro, made by a company called Pine64, which sells the hardware specifically as an open platform meant to run Linux rather than Android. Purism makes a similar device called the Librem 5, built around the same idea but with an even stronger focus on physical hardware kill switches for the camera, microphone, and modem, so you can physically cut power to those components rather than trusting a software toggle. On the software side, the two distributions I actually spent the most time with are Postmarket OS, which is a lightweight distribution built specifically for the constraints of mobile hardware, and Mobian, which is essentially Debian, the same Debian that powers a huge share of the servers on the internet, adapted specifically to run on phone hardware. There is also Ubuntu Touch, maintained by a community project called UBports, which carries forward an idea Canonical actually tried commercially years ago before spinning it off into pure community hands. None of these are owned by Google. None of these are owned by Apple. None of these have a corporate parent whose business model depends on advertising revenue extracted from your behavioral data. Here's what actually happens when you set one of these up, because I think the process itself tells you a lot about the philosophy behind it. You start with a device, in my case a PinePhone, and instead of downloading an app from a curated store, you download a disk image directly from the distribution's own website, the same way you would download a Linux distribution for a laptop. You write that image onto a microSD card or directly onto the phone's internal storage using a flashing tool, boot the device, and you're looking at an actual Linux desktop environment, scaled down and touch adapted, but unmistakably the same kind of interface you would find on a Linux laptop, complete with a terminal you can open at any time and use exactly the way you would on any other Linux machine. There's no Play Store gatekeeping which apps you are allowed to install. There is no developer verification layer standing between you and a piece of software you want to run. If you want to install something, you use the distribution's package manager, the same tool Linux users have used for decades, and if a package does not exist for the app you want, you are free to compile it yourself from source code, something that on Android would be functionally impossible for the vast majority of users, even with the bootloader unlocked. I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further, because I think a lot of videos about this topic oversell it in a way that sets people up for disappointment, and I don't want to do that to you. Daily driving a Linux phone as your only phone, the one you rely on for calls, texts, navigation, and banking, is genuinely rough in 2026, and if I told you otherwise, I would be lying to you. Hardware support on these devices lags significantly behind what you get on a modern flagship Android phone or an iPhone. Camera quality is noticeably behind what you would get on comparable Android hardware, in part because camera performance on modern phones depends heavily on proprietary image processing software that manufacturers do not release, which means Linux developers have to reverse engineer or work around that missing layer entirely. Battery life, particularly on standby, has historically been worse than Android, because a huge amount of low-level power management work that Android does at the driver level has to be replicated or re-implemented by a comparatively tiny community of Linux mobile developers instead of a corporation with thousands of paid engineers. Cellular modem support, meaning actually making and receiving phone calls reliably, has improved significantly over the last few years, but still varies noticeably depending on which carrier you are on and which specific modem hardware your device uses. And a huge number of apps you currently rely on every day, your banking app, certain messaging apps, certain navigation apps, simply do not exist in a native form for these platforms at all, because the developers who make them build for Android and iOS specifically, and have no commercial reason to build for a Linux phone community that, honestly, numbers in the tens of thousands of users worldwide, rather than billions. So why would anyone actually do this, given all of that? For me, and I think for most people who go down this path, it is not about replacing your daily phone with something objectively better in every practical sense, because right now, honestly, it is not. It is about deliberately opting out of an ecosystem that is increasingly built around restricting what you are allowed to do with hardware you paid for and accepting real, tangible trade-offs in exchange for that. It is the same trade-off people make when they choose a Linux laptop over a locked-down Windows machine loaded with telemetry, except taken a step further onto a device that, for most people, has become the single most personal and most surveilled object they own. Let me walk you through specifically what changes when you make this switch, because I think the concrete details matter more than the abstract philosophy. On a stock Android phone, even with careful settings and permission management, a huge amount of background communication happens between your device and Google's servers by default, tied to location services, app synchronization, and diagnostic reporting baked into the operating system itself, at a level most users cannot fully see or control. On a Linux phone running something like Post-Market OS or Mobian, that communication simply does not exist by default because there is no Google account baked into the operating system to communicate with in the first place. You're not fighting settings menus, trying to claw back privacy from a system engineered around collecting your data. There is no data collection infrastructure built into the base operating system for you to fight because the people who built it were never trying to build an advertising platform. They were trying to build a phone that respects the same ownership principle that desktop Linux has respected for 30 years. Here's exactly how I actually set mine up, step by step, in case any of you are seriously considering doing this yourselves, because I think the process is a lot more approachable than people assume, even if the daily experience afterward requires some genuine patience. First, I picked hardware that is officially supported rather than trying to force Linux onto an ordinary Android phone that was never designed for it, because while there are unofficial community ports of Post-Market OS to a limited number of older Android devices, support quality on those varies enormously, and a huge share of hardware features, cameras especially, often simply do not work at all. Buying a Pine phone or a Librem 5 specifically, hardware built from the ground up with Linux support in mind, gave me a far more complete and stable experience than trying to repurpose an old Android phone would have. Second, I downloaded the distribution image directly from the project's own website rather than from any third-party mirror, because with any operating system image you flash onto a device, source matters enormously for both security and reliability. Third, I use the official flashing tools each project documents, which for most of these distributions is a straightforward command line process or a guided flashing utility to write the image onto the device's storage. Fourth, I booted the device for the first time and went through an initial setup process that, notably, at no point asked me to sign into a Google account, an Apple ID, or any other centralized account tied to a corporation, because there simply is not one built into the system. And fifth, I spent the following weeks actually living with the device, installing the apps I needed through the package manager, troubleshooting the inevitable rough edges, and genuinely deciding for myself whether the trade-off was worth it for how I actually use a phone day to day. I think it's worth being honest about where I landed because I don't want to sell you a fantasy. I did not fully replace my main phone with a Linux phone. What I actually did, and what I think is the more realistic path for most people who are interested in this but not ready to give up reliable banking apps and dependable camera performance entirely, is keep the Linux phone as a genuine secondary device, one I use specifically for the things where privacy and openness matter most to me, communication with people I trust through open messaging protocols, note-taking, offline navigation using open mapping data rather than a service that logs every route I have ever searched, and general computing tasks, where I want a real Linux terminal in my pocket rather than a locked-down mobile operating system. My primary phone, for now, is still something running a more conventional operating system, specifically because certain apps I genuinely need for daily life simply are not available anywhere else yet. That might change as the ecosystem matures, and there are real signs it is maturing, with modem and camera support improving meaningfully year over year and a slowly growing catalog of native applications built specifically for these platforms. But I think anyone telling you this is already a seamless one-to-one replacement for a modern smartphone is not being straight with you. And I would rather you go into this with accurate expectations than have you buy the hardware, get frustrated by week 2, and write off the entire idea because nobody told you up front what you were actually getting into. What I do think is worth taking seriously, regardless of whether you personally ever install Linux on a phone, is the underlying pattern this entire situation reveals because it is not actually unique to Android. Every major computing platform, over a long enough timeline, tends to drift toward more restriction rather than less, specifically because restriction is what allows a platform owner to capture more value from the ecosystem built on top of their hardware and software. It happened with game consoles, which went from devices you could freely modify to devices with increasingly aggressive anti-modification measures built directly into the hardware itself. It happened with Windows, which has steadily added more built-in advertising, more default telemetry, and more friction around installing software the operating system itself does not approve of. It is now happening with Android, a platform that spent its first decade explicitly marketing itself as the open alternative to Apple's tightly controlled ecosystem, and is now gradually adopting meaningful pieces of that same closed architecture itself, developer verification requirements, tightening bootloader policies, and an increasingly aggressive security framework that, while genuinely addressing real malware problems, also happens to concentrate more control in the hands of the platform owner with every update. None of this makes Google uniquely villainous, and I want to be fair about that point again before I wrap this up, because it would be easy to turn this into a simple story about an evil corporation locking down your phone out of pure greed, and I don't think that fully captures what is actually happening. Malware distributed through unverified side-loaded apps is a genuine, measurable problem that has hurt real people, particularly in regions where side-loading is more culturally common and financial fraud through fake banking apps has caused real financial damage to real families. Google's stated reasoning for these changes is not fabricated. It is a legitimate response to a legitimate problem. But the solution a company chooses to a legitimate problem still reflects that company's incentives, and a solution that requires every developer to register their legal identity with a single corporation in exchange for the ability to distribute software freely is a solution that happens to concentrate enormous structural power in that corporation's hands, well beyond what is strictly necessary to solve the malware problem it was designed to address. Reasonable people can look at that same set of facts and land in very different places about whether the trade-off is worth it. I am not telling you there's only one correct conclusion here. I'm telling you what the actual trade-off is, as clearly and honestly as I can, so you can decide where you personally land on it. If you take nothing else away from this video, I want it to be this: the Android that many of us grew up thinking of as the permanently open alternative to Apple's walled garden is not a fixed, permanent state of the platform. It is a set of policy decisions made by a company, and those policy decisions can and do change over time, almost always in the direction of more control for the platform owner and less for the person actually holding the device. That does not mean you need to go out and buy a PinePhone this week. For the overwhelming majority of people watching this, the practical trade-offs of a fully Linux-based phone are still genuinely too rough around the edges for daily use, and I think it would be dishonest of me to tell you otherwise just because the idea sounds appealing in the abstract. But I do think it is worth knowing this world exists, worth understanding why a growing number of people are choosing to build and use it despite its rough edges, and worth paying attention to what is actually changing on the platform you already carry in your pocket every single day, rather than assuming the phone you have always known will simply stay the way it has always been. I also want to address the question I know is sitting in a lot of your heads right now, which is whether there was an easier middle ground I skipped past, something less drastic than wiping the phone entirely and replacing the operating system with something built by a small community project. And yes, there genuinely is a middle ground, and I think it deserves a fair mention here rather than being ignored just because it is not the path I ultimately chose. Projects like Graphene OS take a different approach entirely. Instead of replacing Android with Linux, they take the open source foundation that Android is actually built on, since Android itself is built on top of the Linux kernel, strip out Google's proprietary layer on top of it, and rebuild a hardened, privacy-focused version of Android itself, one that still runs the vast majority of ordinary Android apps, but without the deep default integration into Google's services. That path keeps far more app compatibility than a full Linux phone does, since you are still technically running Android underneath, just a version of it with the tracking and the Google account requirement stripped away. The trade-off is that it currently only supports a small number of specific devices, largely Google's own Pixel line, specifically because those are the phones where the bootloader can still be officially unlocked and where the hardware drivers are open enough to rebuild the system on top of. If what you actually want is privacy and control without giving up the app ecosystem you already depend on, that path is worth researching on its own before you consider going as far as I did. I chose the more extreme option specifically because I wanted to understand what a phone looks like with absolutely no corporate operating system underneath it at all, not even a modified one. But I would not blame anyone for deciding that Graphene OS or a similar hardened Android alternative is the more sensible choice for their actual daily life. Let me also walk you through what actually happens to the apps you already rely on when you make a jump like this, because I think this is the part people underestimate the most until they are already living with the decision. Messaging is actually in a surprisingly good place. Open protocols like Matrix and Signal both have working native or near native clients on Postmarket OS and Mobian, and since both of those services are built around open, documented protocols rather than proprietary closed systems, getting them running is far less painful than you would expect. Email works exactly the way it always has, because email has never depended on any particular operating system to function. It is one of the oldest open protocols on the internet, and it works identically whether you are checking it from a Linux phone, a Linux laptop, or anything else. Web browsing works through full versions of Firefox and Chromium, not stripped-down mobile browsers, which sounds like a small detail but actually matters enormously, because it means you're getting the real, complete web rather than an App Store-approved subset of it. maps and navigation, are handled through OpenStreetMap-based applications, which will not have the exact same real-time traffic data that a service backed by billions of location pings can offer, but which do provide genuinely usable offline navigation without a single byte of your route data ever being sent to a corporate server. Where things fall apart, and I want to be completely straight with you about this rather than glossing over it, is anything that depends on a proprietary software development kit tightly controlled by a single company. Most banking apps fall into this category. Most ride-sharing apps fall into this category. Certain heavily used social platforms fall into this category too. For those, your only realistic option on a Linux phone right now is using the mobile website version through a full browser instead of a dedicated app, which works for some services reasonably well and simply does not work at all for others, particularly ones that actively detect and block browser access, specifically to push you toward their app instead. I think it is also worth talking honestly about who this is actually for, because I do not want to give the impression that everyone watching this should go do exactly what I did. If your daily life depends on mobile banking with an app that has no usable browser alternative, if you rely heavily on a ride-sharing or food delivery app with no web equivalent, or if you simply need your phone to reliably work every single time without any troubleshooting, a full Linux phone as your only device is very likely going to cause you real frustrating problems in 2026, and I would rather tell you that clearly now than have you find out the hard way after spending money on hardware. This is genuinely a better fit right now for developers, for people who already run Linux on a laptop or desktop and want that same philosophy extended to a device that fits in their pocket for privacy researchers, and for people who, like me, are willing to keep a second, more conventional phone around, specifically for the handful of apps that have no real alternative yet. It is a hobbyist and enthusiast space right now, genuinely and honestly, the same way early Linux on the desktop was a hobbyist and enthusiast space decades before it became something ordinary people could realistically use for everyday work. But here's the thing I keep coming back to, and it is the reason I made this video in the first place, rather than just quietly using the phone myself and moving on. Every open computing platform we have ever gotten access to started out exactly this rough. Desktop Linux in its early years was genuinely difficult, full of hardware that did not work correctly, drivers that had to be compiled by hand, and communities of a few thousand dedicated people keeping the whole thing alive through sheer persistence long before it became stable enough to run on server infrastructure for a meaningful share of the entire internet. The Linux phone community is sitting roughly where desktop Linux was decades ago, and the direction it is moving in, more supported hardware every year, more native applications, better modem compatibility, is the same direction desktop Linux moved in before it became something enormous numbers of people rely on today, without ever thinking twice about it. Whether that same trajectory plays out for phones the way it did for desktops is not something I can promise you, and anyone who tells you it is a guaranteed outcome is overselling it. But I think it is worth supporting and worth paying attention to, specifically because the alternative, a mobile computing world where every major platform is owned, gated, and increasingly restricted by one of two enormous corporations, is not a hypothetical future. It is close to the world we already live in, and it is the exact world that pushed me toward doing this in the first place. If any part of this made you curious enough to actually look into it yourself, the Postmarket OS and Mobian Project websites both have detailed, genuinely well-written documentation walking through exactly which devices are supported and exactly what to expect, written by the same community of people actually building this software, not by anyone trying to sell you anything. Start there before you spend money on hardware. Read honestly about which features work and which ones still have rough edges on the specific device you are considering, and go in with realistic expectations, rather than the idea that you are about to seamlessly replace your smartphone overnight. That is genuinely not what this is, at least not yet. But it is real, it works, it is improving every year, and it exists as a living reminder that the phone in your pocket does not have to be something you are only ever granted conditional access to. It can still, if you are willing to accept the trade-offs, be something you actually own. I want to leave you with one last thought, because I think it is easy to watch a video like this, nod along, and then close the app and forget about it within the hour. The same way most information about how our devices actually work tends to slide off us in the middle of an ordinary day. The reason platforms are able to drift slowly toward more restriction over time is not because any single update feels dramatic enough in the moment to provoke a real reaction. It is because each individual change feels small, reasonable, and easy to accept on its own. A security improvement here, a verification requirement there, until years later the platform looks nothing like the open system it started as, and by then most people have simply adapted without ever consciously deciding to. You do not have to install Linux on a phone to push back against that pattern. You can push back against it just by staying aware of what is actually changing on the device you already own by reading the actual policy changes, instead of only the headlines about them, and by asking, every time a platform adds a new layer of control, who that control genuinely benefits and what it actually costs you in return. That habit of paying attention is worth more than any specific piece of hardware I could recommend to you today. The phone is just where I happen to apply it.